Kenneth Kelly, one of our nation's leading financial and banking administrators. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chavis. Thanks for having me today.
Tell us how you became chairman and CEO of a Black-owned bank.
Well, Dr. Chavis, you know there are only 17 now left in the country out of approximately 5,000 banks. And
let's say that again. Only 17?
There are only 17 African-American owned and controlled banks in this country out of nearly 5,000 banks in our country today. And so to your point, it does come with a lot of responsibility, one that I take dear heart and great care in thinking about on a daily basis. But I was fortunate enough to sit in this seat because of the vision of a man named Don Davis, who was a cousin of mine. He actually bought this bank some 42 years ago. And unfortunately, we lost him in 2014. And now we have the opportunity to really carry on his legacy and being sure that we provide financial services to the area of Detroit, Michigan, and now recently in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And this was one of those efforts where Wells Fargo was certainly, I would say, a very generous team player. We actually ended up moving into one of their established branches. In fact, it was the only branch in that area that had a drive-through. And so Wells Fargo, because of our banking relationship and regulations, couldn't make that happen directly with us. They actually donated that building, Dr. Chavis, to a nonprofit called PPL, which really focused on affordable housing for the Minneapolis market. And then we became a leasee of that building through the nonprofit, because otherwise it would have been more challenging for us to move into that market.
So tell us, how does a brother from Alabama wind up having an impact in Detroit?
Many African Americans looked for opportunities in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they started that migration up north. Detroit was one of those hotbeds. In fact, I say to people all the time, one thing you can be sure of, if someone's from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, or South Carolina, they likely have someone who has been to Detroit or lived in Detroit. And that was true for our family too. A segment of my family moved to Detroit many years ago. And the cousin that I mentioned earlier, he was a part of that. And so the bottom line is we have family there in Detroit, and that's a deep root system for us, along with Chicago, Pittsburgh, and some of those other industrialized cities when people move for better jobs from the ag system to the industrial system.
You know, there are a lot of big banks and small banks. You know, there's Wells Fargo, Chase, Bank of America. Do any of these big banks try to help minority-owned banks?
Dr. Chavis, I had the pleasure of serving as the chairman of the National Bankers Association. It's been around since 1927, coming up on 100 years.
That's the Black bankers.
That's the Black bankers, but it also now is broader than just Black bankers also. We include other minorities. But what I would tell you, when I served as chairman in that role, in fact, just 3 years ago, 2019, we convened a table and had 8 of the top 10 banks sit around the table to at least hear our story. And I will tell you, Wells Fargo was the first to recognize, in looking at the data, and this was data by Milken Institute, that African-American banks were undercapitalized, which means they can't be as effective in their communities.
And what year was this study?
The study is not in 2019. We had the discussion in 2019. But the bottom line is Wells stepped up, and through their leadership, their chairman, Bill Daley, Sanders Adu, along with Gigi Dixon, by that March, they had made a commitment of injecting $50 million into Black, I'm gonna be real specific about this, not just minority, but Black-led and owned institutions. And so from that, what we have seen in even the catalyst of George Floyd's murder, we have seen investments from many of those large banks now, not just Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase, Citi. We've seen them also from US Bank. And so the point I'm making is I think there's a clear recognition in this day and time that minority institutions, specifically Black institutions, needed capital to be successful in supporting the communities that they really care about.
I hear from a lot of millennials, Generation Z, a lot of young people say they want to stack their paper.
Yes.
Can you talk about the importance of investing one's financial resources?
It doesn't matter if you are working in sanitation or if you're an engineer or a CEO. If you appropriately account for 18% of your salary, by the time you get to your age of 61, 62, you will have enough of a nest egg to live on that will carry you into your 80s and 90s without having to worry about working.
So you've written a book.
Yes.
Tell us about your book.
Well, it's to the point you just brought up. It's about wealth. When I look at and think about wealth and what I just shared earlier about whether you make $30,000 a year or $5 million a year, your wealth is still your wealth. And what I found is, and particularly in the African American community, only 3 out of 10 African Americans have a will. That's a failure for our community. And some of that is cultural. We do not want to deal with our own mortality and morbidity. I write about my story in dealing with that and how that almost became a mistake in my family. But I also write about a lot of well-known people that we all know and respect. And let me say this, I write this as lessons learned, not a detriment of any of their characters, because I respect each and every one of them as individuals. But Chad Boseman's story has been in the news. You know about that. That was in my book that we finished at the latter part of the year. James Brown's story, 15 years, 12 lawsuits, 15 years to settle his estate. Prince's estate. At the time I documented in the book, the attorneys alone had billed his estate $10 million. Those $10 million would not get to his heirs and the people he cared about. John Singleton, leader, Boys in the Hood, becoming of age of me as a young man, had some of those same challenges. But we also write about everyday people in our book. The school teacher who worked all of her life, paid for a house, died without a will. 2 kids, they get roughly about $10,000 apiece. That house is turned and flipped and sold for almost $200,000. That is wealth that is lost in our community every day. And so I'm here to strongly encourage everyone to have a will, a healthcare directive, and a power of attorney. So we write about that in the book, but I also write about stories, Doc, to show that sometimes it's not about the material things, it's about philosophy. So the latter part of my book is the discussion about what's important to me and my philosophy that I want to leave my kids, not just the material things.
In your role, also now with the American Bankers Association, you get a chance to see the whole panoply of what big banks are doing. How would you evaluate their relationship?
Well, I would tell you they're moving in the right direction. I would tell you it's not moving fast enough, just as I've stated. But what I would tell you, Wells Fargo, again, they stood up first and basically made a commitment of $50 million to invest in Black banks. I'm gonna say that very clearly, Black banks. And they followed through on that. And so we were one of the recipients of that. I'm proud to say. We went through the investigation and background checks, and just like every other investor would, to
Sure.
determine if you're worthy of being invested in. And so we were fortunate enough to be worthy to be invested in. But I would tell you the intent is this is a long haul discussion, Dr. Chavis. The relationships are getting off to a good start. Wells Fargo, again, I'll give another example. They were critical to our move to Minneapolis. Many may know, your listeners, Minneapolis is where George Floyd was murdered. 5 major banks and leaders in that market came together and said, we want to do something different as banking institutions. They checked their badges at the door and sat around the table. And from that conversation, the discussion of looking at open the first African-American owned and controlled bank or branch in Minneapolis came about.
That's very positive. You know, a lot of times after these tragedies, like what happened to George Floyd, after the media goes away, the community is left not only traumatized by what happened with the tragedy, but there's been no real relief. But for you to say now that First Independence Bank is not only in Detroit, but now you're in Minneapolis.
That's correct.
That's very significant.
It was unprecedented to see banks that represented 80% of that market, in terms of they represented 80% of the deposits, to say welcome to another bank coming into that market. But it just goes to show that there are some genuine individuals and leaders out there who are looking to make real change. And I can tell you, I'm proud to be associated with them. Now, the good news for us is, yes, we're there and we have gotten the pledges. We've got a lot of work to still do in that market, but that group is now still meeting and looking at other ways that we can be helpful in creating change that could be impactful.
Kenneth Kelly, what gives you your greatest hope for America?
Dr. Chavis, I have 2 kids. I know one day I'm going to leave here. My greatest hope is that they live in a society that appreciate them, as Dr. King said, for their character, that they be contributors to society, and I'm pouring all I can into them and others. As I wrote about in my book, talking about who I am, I set up endowments and scholarships for African Americans to be engineers from my hometown of Eufaula to go to Auburn University before I even had the funding available for my own kids to go to college. because I have seen that education can
So
be
giving,
life-changing.
giving back is a part of your own evolution.
I say it more simply, giving is a part of living. And for me, I'm in what I consider now my legacy building years in terms of being able to give as much of myself for others to be able to carry on. I inherit a legacy. I have 4 generations that's buried in Barber County, with the oldest that we know of, who was a slave brought by a Scottish banker, ironically, from South Carolina to Alabama. And so that's who I am, as whose I am. And I would tell you, my greatest hope is that America will continue to evolve on this topic of inclusion, on this topic of recognizing what Dr. King asked of us in his dream, that individuals be recognized for their character and the content of their character.